There's a kind of silence that soldiers learn to read. Not the silence of empty fields or quiet mornings. The silence that comes right before everything changes. The kind that sits in a man's chest like a held breath, like a stone dropped into still water, waiting for the ripple that hasn't arrived yet but is already on its way. Sergeant Daniel Mercer knew that silence. He had lived in it for 11 months across 2 deployments. He knew how dust smelled when a convoy was close. He knew how a rooftop looked when someone had been on it recently. He knew the weight of a radio in his hand when it had been quiet too long. But on the morning of April 14th, 2009, in the Crackled Valley of eastern Afghanistan, a place soldiers called the Valley of Death not for poetry, but for arithmetic, Daniel Mercer knew something else too. Something he hadn't expected to know in a place like that, at a time like that, in a life like his. He knew he was about to ask Staff Sergeant Maria Reyes to marry him. The ring was a folded piece of copper wire he had shaped himself, sitting in the front pocket of his body armor for 6 weeks. He had no jeweler, no candlelit restaurant, no speech rehearsed into a bathroom mirror. What he had was a woman who had pulled him out of his own head 3 times in 2 years, a valley full of fog and red rock, and a radio that had been quiet for 22 minutes. 22 minutes was enough. He had decided. He turned to her. Then the radio crackled. And everything, the ring, the fog, the 22 minutes of quiet, the rest of their lives, collapsed into a single word from a voice neither of them would ever forget. Contact. Asterisk, what happened in the next 4 hours would take them years to talk about. What happened in the years after that would take even longer. This is that story. All of it. The parts that made the news and the parts that never did. The heroism and the cost of it. The love that survived a valley that wasn't supposed to let anything survive. And the long, strange road that love had to walk to find its way back to a piece of bent copper wire. It begins with a radio. It ends, finally, with an answer. Sergeant Daniel Mercer had been carrying the ring for 43 days before he almost used it. It wasn't much of a ring, technically. A jeweler's son from Columbus, Ohio would have laughed at it. It was a 4-inch strip of copper wire stripped from a broken field communications cable, bent into a rough circle by Daniel's hands over 3 evenings in the FOB common room, while his squad played cards and pretended not to notice. He had twisted the ends together and filed the joints smooth against a concrete block until the seam almost disappeared. Not quite, but almost. He wrapped a thin strip of fabric from a worn-out tan undershirt around the band because bare copper leaves a green ring on skin, and Maria Reyes deserved better than a green ring on her finger, even if everything else about the proposal was going to be exactly as unromantic as the Crackled Valley allowed. The Crackled. The soldiers stationed there didn't talk about it the way civilians talk about dangerous places, not with drama or distant reverence. They talked about it the way people talk about a neighborhood dog that bites. Matter of fact, specific, respectful in a way that has nothing to do with admiration and everything to do with not wanting to get your hand taken off. The valley sat in Khyber province in the northeast corner of Afghanistan, pressed against the Pakistani border, surrounded by ridgelines that turned into firing positions with a frequency that felt almost personal. In 5 years of American presence there, the Crackled had consumed more ammunition, more medevacs, and more 22-year-old lives than almost anywhere else in the entire war. Some units bled just from existing inside it. The mountains did not care about your reasons for being there. Neither did the men who lived in them. Daniel had been assigned to the valley on his 2nd deployment. The first had been Helmand Province, flatter, hotter, a different kind of dangerous. The Crackled felt like it had been designed specifically to make everything harder. The altitude punished your lungs. The terrain punished your knees. The ridgelines punished your assumptions. Every patrol was a geometry problem where the answer kept changing, and getting it wrong even once was a cost no equation could absorb. He had met Maria Reyes at the beginning of that 2nd deployment, which is to say he had met her 3 weeks before he knew her name. She was attached to his company as a specialist in communications and tactical coordination, which in practice meant she was smarter than most of the men around her and had been doing the work of 2 people since before anyone thought to promote her for it. Daniel's first memory of her was not a romantic one. It was a briefing, and she was pointing at a topographic map with the tip of a pen and explaining to a senior officer why his proposed patrol route was, in her words, a gift to anyone on that ridge with a PKM and a bad attitude. She used the word gift. She said it politely, clearly, the way someone says a thing they have already said 3 times and expect to have to say again. The officer adjusted the route. Daniel, standing in the back of the room, had thought, I want to know that person. It took him 3 weeks of shared patrols for late-night radio shifts and one very bad firefight near Outpost for Strepo before he understood what that wanting actually was. The firefight was in November. A patrol had pushed too far up a secondary ridgeline chasing an intelligence lead that turned out to be 2 months old, and the contact came from above and to the west at the same time, which meant the geometry was bad before anyone fired a second shot. 3 men went down in the first 90 seconds. None killed, but 2 unable to move without help. Maria was not supposed to be in the field that day. She had come along to monitor a frequency handoff between 2 patrol elements, which was a support role, a background task, the kind of thing that keeps people safely at the edges of a situation. She did not stay at the edge. Daniel had been directing suppressing fire toward the western ridgeline when he heard her voice on the tactical radio calling in a medevac coordinate that she had calculated herself, under fire, using a damaged GPS unit and a compass, while providing covering fire with her own rifle for the 2 men she was keeping alive until the bird arrived. He didn't see her face until the contact broke 20 minutes later. He saw the back of her head. He saw her crouch over one of the wounded soldiers and adjust his tourniquet with the calm, focused efficiency of someone who had decided, somewhere in the first 10 seconds, that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. He learned her name that night. He spent the next 6 months learning everything else. What he learned was this. Maria Reyes was from Brownsville, Texas, the 3rd of 4 children, the only one who had joined the military, the one her mother had cried about the most and bragged about the most in the same breath. She had a laugh that arrived fast and left fast and meant more for being brief. She read paperback novels and dog-eared the pages, which Daniel found mildly offensive in the way that only the most endearing habits can be. She was serious in the field and ridiculous outside of it, which is the correct ratio for survival in a place like the Crackled. She had buried 2 friends in her first deployment. She did not talk about them, but she wore a small blue paracord bracelet on her left wrist that had not come off in the 18 months Daniel had known her, and he had learned not to ask. He had also learned, sometime around month 4, that he was in love with her in a way that had no tactical component and no reasonable exit strategy, and was therefore the most frightening thing the Crackled had presented him with yet. He made the ring in February. He carried it for 43 days because he was waiting for the right moment, which is a thing people do in places where the right moment is always interrupted by the wrong one. April 14th arrived cold and foggy, the way Crackled mornings arrived in spring, with a low ceiling and the kind of quiet that fills in after a noisy night. The previous evening had included a probing contact on the eastern wire. Nothing sustained more harassment than assault, and the camp had been on elevated alert through the dark hours. By dawn, the alert had stepped down. Patrols were holding. The radio traffic from the outlying observation posts had thinned to check-ins. The valley was doing its thing where it pretended, briefly, to be just a valley. Daniel and Maria were at the northern end of the forward operating base, near a low concrete wall that served no structural purpose anyone could explain, sitting with their backs against it and their rifles across their knees and 2 cups of coffee that had been hot 20 minutes ago. This was in the Crackled, what passed for privacy. 20 feet of nobody watching and a wall between them and the wind. Maria was reading. She always read when the tempo dropped. Daniel was not reading. He was watching the fog move across the ridgeline to the north and thinking about the copper ring in his vest pocket and running a series of calculations that had nothing to do with patrol routes. He had rehearsed things to say. He had discarded all of them. He had settled, after considerable internal deliberation, on something close to the truth, which was that she was the best person he had met in either of his deployments or really anywhere, and that he had a ring in his pocket that he was aware was not a real ring, but that meant a real thing, and that he wanted to know if she would be willing to treat it like one. He thought this was a reasonable speech. He thought the moment was as close to right as the Kringle was going to give him. He turned to her. She had looked up from her book half a second before he turned, the way she sometimes did, like she had heard something before it arrived. He opened his mouth. The radio crackled. Not a check-in. Not routine traffic. The voice that came through was Corporal Andrews at Observation Post 3, and his voice had a specific texture that everyone on the net recognized instantly. Not panic, soldiers were trained out of panic, but the tightened, clipped, eyes-forward quality of someone who has just identified a problem and is reporting it while already doing 3 things simultaneously. November actual, this is OP3. I have movement, West Ridgeline, grid Romeo Tango 945. Minimum 6 elements, possible more behind the rocks. They are not civilians. Over. The word over landed in the morning air, and the morning air rearranged itself. Maria was already on her feet, book closed, radio in hand, moving toward the command post at a pace that wasn't running, but covered ground the way running did. Daniel was 2 steps behind her. The copper ring pressed against his sternum through the vest pocket, warm from his body heat. He thought, not yet. He thought, soon. The command post was 15 meters of organized urgency. Captain Okafor had the tactical map spread on the planning table before Daniel, and Maria reached the door, and the picture that map was building in real time was not a good one. OP3 had visual on a coordinated movement, the kind that suggests rehearsal, suggests preparation, suggests that the night of probing contact on the eastern wire had not been harassment at all. It had been reconnaissance. The eastern probe had been a question. The western movement was the answer, and it had been moving into position while they slept. This is a coordinated pincer, Maria said. She said it to no one in particular. She said it the way she said things she had already processed while everyone else was still looking at the map. Captain Okafor looked at her. Recommendations? Counter battery on the western ridgeline buys us time, but commits our fires before we know the 3rd element. 3rd. There's a 3rd, she said. There always is. She was right. There was. It came from the south, which is where nobody had been looking, and it came with RPGs, which changed the geometry of everything in about 4 seconds. The first round hit the vehicle bay and didn't penetrate the hardened wall, but sent shrapnel through the open vehicle gate and took down 2 mechanics who had been doing a morning inspection with the unconcerned routine of men who expected the morning to stay what it was. Daniel was out of the command post and moving toward the gate before the dust settled. He could hear Maria behind him on the radio, her voice steady and precise, working the medevac frequency and the fire support net at the same time, doing the impossible 2-phone act she had been doing since Restrepo, building the picture in real time while the picture was still on fire. The next 40 minutes were the kind that compress into fragments when recalled later. Not a sequence, a collection. The sound of the saw working on the southern wire. The weight of a wounded private over Daniel's shoulder for 30 meters that felt like 300. The moment when the Western group made its push and the geometry got bad again, and Maria's voice on the radio calling the adjusted fire coordinates with the calm of a woman reading aloud from a document. Not a woman standing in a forward operating base that was taking contact from 3 directions while her hands bled from a cut she hadn't stopped to address. He saw her hands later. After. 2 deep cuts on her right palm from the corner of a metal equipment case she had grabbed to use as a ballistic barrier for a wounded radio operator she had positioned herself in front of when the second RPG came over the wall. She had not mentioned the cuts. She had continued working the radio. He saw her hands, and he felt something in his chest that had no military vocabulary attached to it whatsoever. The contact broke around 10:30. The enemy withdrew back into the ridgeline, which was what they did. They were not trying to hold ground. They were trying to cost ground, and they had spent the morning spending that currency. 2 Americans wounded seriously, for with minor injuries. None killed. The mechanics from the vehicle bay were stable. One would lose partial hearing in his left ear. The other would be back on duty in 3 weeks. By the operational math of the Crackled, it had been a good morning. Daniel found Maria at the medical station helping the corpsman restock supplies, her right hand wrapped in a field bandage, her radio on the table beside her, her paperback novel, somehow retrieved, somehow unharmed, sitting on top of the radio. She looked up when he walked in. He looked at the bandaged hand. He looked at her face. He looked at the novel. "You're going to dog-ear the page," he said. She looked at the novel and then back at him. "Idoa pages." "I know. You hate that." "Ido." There was a pause. The kind of pause that in any other life, any other place, would have been full of things they should have said already. "I had something I was going to say this morning," Daniel said. Before Andrews called in, Maria looked at him steadily. She had the specific quality which he had noticed early and never stopped noticing of being fully present in a conversation, not waiting for her turn to talk. Actually there. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I've known for about 3 weeks," she said. "I was waiting for you to get to it." He reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out the copper ring, slightly bent from the morning, the fabric wrap still intact, the seams still almost invisible. He put on the table between them. She looked at it for a long moment. "That's copper wire," she said, "from a comm cable, with fabric, so it doesn't leave a green mark." She picked it up. She held it between 2 fingers. Her wrapped hand, her uninjured hand, the ring between them. The medical station smelled like antiseptic and gun oil and the particular smell of people who have been working very hard in a small space for a long time. "You were going to ask me this morning," she said. "Against the wall." "Yes." "Before the radio." "Yes." She looked at the ring. She looked at him. "Ask me now," she said. He did. She said yes before he finished the sentence, which was not how he had rehearsed it, but was, he thought, considerably better. The ring fit almost exactly. The fabric kept it from turning. She wore it on her right hand because the left hand was bandaged, and she wore it for the rest of the deployment, and when people asked what it was, she said a gift, which was true in all the ways that mattered, and in none of the ways that were easy to explain. That was the beginning of what they thought was their story. They were wrong. The real story was just now finding its starting point, and it was not located in the Crackled Valley. It was located in the years after, which are the years nobody photographs, the years nobody deploys you into, the years where the hardest terrain is the one you carry home inside your own chest and are expected, somehow, to navigate without a map. Coming home is supposed to be the easy part. That is what people say. That is what the posters at the airport say, the ones with the wide-angle photographs of reunions, of children sprinting across terminal floors toward uniforms, of couples holding each other in the specific way, of people who have been practicing the embrace in their heads for months and are now surprised to find that the real thing is both more and less than the rehearsed version. Coming home is the reward. It is what the hard part earns you. Daniel Mercer came home to Columbus, Ohio on a Tuesday in September 2009, 5 months after the morning against the wall, 3 months after the ring had been replaced with a real one. A simple gold band bought at a PX in Bagram, modest and clean, and 11 days after his battalion had been officially released from the Crackled, which itself had been officially released from American military use shortly thereafter. The whole valley handed back to the mountains as if the mountains had been, waiting patiently, and were not surprised. He came home to a ground-floor apartment his sister had helped set up during his absence, to a neighborhood that smelled like cut grass and gasoline and nothing dangerous, to a city that moved at a pace he could not locate himself inside of, to a life that was waiting for him like a set of clothes laid out on a bed that he had been told would fit. They did not fit. This was not unusual. The counselors at the Transition Assistance Program said so. The pamphlet said so. Other veterans said so, in the oblique, sideways way that men say things they don't have clean language for. Everyone agreed it was normal, that adjustment took time, that the brain recalibrates, that the hypervigilance and the sleeplessness and the reflexive scanning of exit routes in restaurants would eventually quiet. Everyone agreed. Nobody mentioned that eventually is not a number. Maria came home 3 weeks later. Her separation from service was 1 month behind Daniel's. Administrative timing, paperwork, the particular slowness of military bureaucracy when it is processing the end of something rather than the beginning. She had spent that extra month at Bugram running downtrace communications, which means she had spent it working because Maria Reyes, absent an active mission, invented one. She arrived in Brownsville first, spent 2 weeks with her mother, and then drove to Columbus in a car that had been in storage for 14 months with a mixed CD in the console that she had made before deployment, and listened to for the entirety of a 14-hour drive because she needed something from before. They moved into the ground floor apartment together on a Wednesday. On Thursday morning, Daniel woke at 4:30 a.m. and sat at the kitchen table in the dark for 2 hours, facing the door. He did not tell her about this for 3 weeks. She found out because she woke at 4 a.m. one night and came to the kitchen for water and found him there rigid in his chair, not asleep, watching the door with the patient, attentive stillness of a man posted at an observation point. She stood in the kitchen doorway for a moment. She did not turn on the light. She filled her glass at the sink in the dark and went back to bed. The next morning over coffee, she said, very casually, "How long has it been going on?" He looked at her over his mug. "The door thing," she said. He looked at his coffee. "Couple weeks." She nodded. She sipped her coffee. She did not say it was normal. She did not say he should talk to someone. She said, "I've been checking the parking lot when I leave the building. Twice each time. Going out and coming back." He looked at her. "Twice," he repeated. "Before I let myself believe it's clear." They sat with that for a moment. The specific, quiet recognition of two people who are carrying the same thing in different shaped containers. It helped, that recognition. For a while, it helped a great deal. The first year was hard in the way that first years often are, which means the hardness arrived sideways. Not in the large moments, but in the small, accumulated ones, the ones that don't announce themselves as significant until they have been happening for 6 months, and you look back and see the shape of them. Daniel could not keep a job past 3 months. Not for performance reasons. He was competent. He was disciplined. He was exactly the kind of employee that civilian employers thought they wanted when they hire veterans, and then discovered they had hired someone whose internal calibration was set to a tempo civilian life does not run at. The problem was boredom, which sounds trivial and was not. In the Crackled, boredom was a luxury, a brief and unreliable condition that existed between genuine demands on your full attention. In Columbus, it was the default state. There was nothing at stake at 3 p.m. on a Tuesday in a mid-level logistics company. He knew this. He could not make himself feel it. He left 3 jobs. He started a 4th, doing security consulting for a firm that paid well and had contracts he found interesting for about 6 weeks before they cycled to contracts he found deadening. Maria did better on the surface of it. She found work faster in a federal contracting role that used her communications background and operated at a pace that at least resembled urgency. She was good at it. She got promoted inside 4 months. She did not sit at the kitchen table watching the door. What she did, which Daniel did not see for longer than he should have, was not sleep. Not the 4 a.m. vigilance, kind of not sleeping. The lying still kind. The flat on her back, eyes open in the dark, breathing measured and controlled, internal landscape working through something she had not told him about and was not going to tell him about because she had constructed a very competent, very durable partition between what she felt and what she showed, and that partition had been one of her primary survival tools in the Crackled, and she did not know how to dismantle it in a ground floor apartment in Columbus just because the war was over. The war was not over. This was the thing nobody's pamphlet said clearly enough. The war does not end when the deployment ends. It relocates. It sets up in the body, in the architecture of sleep, in a way you flinch at a car backfiring 3 blocks away, in a way a stranger touching your shoulder in a grocery store can send you back 5 years before your conscious mind catches up with your nervous system. It lives in the part of the brain that was rewired under conditions the brain was never designed for, and does not know how to unwire just because the conditions have changed. Maria's partition held for 14 months after they came home. Then it came apart on a night in November, quietly and without drama, which was so exactly how Maria did things that Daniel almost missed it. He came home from an evening shift to find her sitting on the kitchen floor, not collapsed, not distressed in the visible sense, just sitting with her back against the cabinet and her knees up and her paracord bracelet held between both hands, the blue one, the one she had never taken off, the one he had learned not to ask about. He sat down on the floor next to her. He did not ask anything. After a while, she said, "I looked them up today." He knew who she meant. The bracelet. The names attached to it. Their families, she said. I looked up their families. I don't know why I did that today. I've been not doing it for 3 years. She turned the bracelet in her hands. One of them has a daughter, she said. She was 2 when he died. She's 5 now. There's a photo online. She looks like him. She said this in a level, even voice, the voice she used when she was managing something large. He did not say anything for a while. Then, he said, "Tell me about them." She looked at him. Not the managing look. A different one. "You never asked." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. Then she told him. Both of them. First deployment. 2 men she had served with, trained with, eaten bad food with, laughed with, and then watched die in a way she had never been able to find language for that didn't either over-explain it or reduce it to something it wasn't. She told him their names, which Daniel stored with the care they deserved. She told him about Hernandez, who had been funny in the bone-dry, anti-comedic way of someone who had decided that laughter was the most dignified response available, who had called her Reyes of Sunshine for 6 months until it had become a real name. She told him about Calloway, who had been 23 and from Maine and had carried a pocket-sized bird identification book through 2 countries because he had a thing about birds, which everyone else found eccentric, and Maria had found quietly heroic because it was the act of someone who had decided that the world outside the war deserved to be known and named even from the inside of it. She told him about the day she had stopped being able to save either of them. She did not cry while she told it. She told it straight and clean, the way you tell something you have been rehearsing alone for years. And when she was done, the kitchen was quiet, and Daniel put his arm around her, and she leaned into it, not dramatically, just the small physical concession of someone who has been holding something alone for a very long time and is willing, finally, to share the weight. They sat on the kitchen floor for a long time. It was, in its way, better than the ring. It was the thing after the ring, the thing the ring had been making a promise toward without either of them knowing the full scope of what that promise meant. Not just the easy parts, not just the mourning against the wall and the copper wire and the heroism that made sense as a story. The parts that didn't make a clean story. The floor. The bracelet. The names. After that night, the partition came down slowly, as things that have been constructed carefully come down, piece by piece, over time, with occasional reversals. They started going to a veterans group in late winter, which Daniel found less useful than Maria did, and Maria found less useful than she eventually admitted. They found a counselor who understood what they were working with and did not treat it like a problem to be solved in 6 weeks. They argued, twice badly, once catastrophically, over things that were about other things, the way arguments always are. They got through it each time, not because their love was uncomplicated, it was not, but because they had been trained to hold a position under pressure, and they had, somewhere along the way, decided to apply that skill to each other. The real ring, the Bagram PX ring, lived on Maria's finger every day. She had packed the copper ring in a small box with the blue paracord bracelet in the top drawer of the dresser, which is not where you put things you are hiding from yourself. It is where you put things you're not ready to let go of, but are not ready to carry on your body either. The top drawer is a middle place, an honest place, this is real and I am not ready place. Daniel knew it was there. He didn't look at it often, but sometimes passing the dresser on a morning when the city outside the window felt very far from every place he had been and very close to every feeling he had brought back with him, he would put his hand on the drawer for a moment. Not opening it, just knowing. There's a version of this story where 2 years of adjustment, 1 good counselor, and 1 night on a kitchen floor resolves into a clean, upward arc, where they build a life together with the competence they brought to everything else, and the hard part becomes a chapter with a known ending, visited occasionally for perspective. This is not entirely wrong. The arc was real. The progress was real. But in the spring of their second year home, something arrived that neither of them had planned for, which is both the most ordinary and most disruptive thing that can happen to two people who are still finding the shape of their ordinary lives. Maria got a call. Not a military call. A personal one from a woman in Brownsville named Dora, who was Maria's mother's closest friend, who was calling to say that Maria's mother had been diagnosed with early-stage Alzheimer's disease, and that the family was having a conversation about what came next, and Maria's input was needed, which was the careful and insufficient way of saying, "Come home." Daniel watched Maria take that call from across the room. He watched her face do the thing it did when she was processing something large. The slight stillness, the eyes that go somewhere internal and specific, the jaw that sets not with anger, but with the preparing to carry quality of a person who has been taught by experience to take the weight rather than wait for someone to take it from her. He watched her hang up. She stood with the phone in her hand for a moment. Then she said, "I need to go back to Brownsville." Not a question, not a request, an assessment, a mission parameter. The next thing, he said, "For how long?" She said, "I don't know yet." And he understood, from the way she said it, that not knowing yet was not the same as temporarily. That the thing she was walking toward was not a visit, but a reorganization. That the life they had been building in Columbus, carefully and imperfectly and together, was about to encounter the same kind of call that had interrupted everything before. Not a radio this time. Not a corporal at an observation post with movement on the Western Ridgeline. A phone. A mother. A family that needed the most competent person in it to come back and apply her competence to something that was not a war and was absolutely a war. He said, "I'll come with you." She looked at him. "Columbus isn't working that well anyway," he said. It was not a grand gesture. It was not the proposal against the wall. It was the quieter thing, the thing that follows the grand gesture by years, the thing that is actually what the grand gesture was promising. Not the moment, but the accumulation of moments, the willingness to keep reorganizing, to keep showing up, to treat the partnership as a living document rather than a signed contract. She crossed the room and put her arms around him. Not dramatically, just the weight of it, the whole weight of her against his chest. He held her. Outside, Columbus did its Tuesday afternoon thing, indifferent and continuous. Inside, two people who had learned to read the specific silence before everything changes stood in their kitchen and listened to it together. They would be in the car by Friday. Brownsville in April is all bougainvillea and salt wind from the Gulf and the particular quality of heat that arrives before noon and means business. It is also Maria's mother making coffee at 6 in the morning with the precise, confident movements of a woman who does not yet know she is forgetting, and Daniel standing in the kitchen doorway of a house that smells like cumin and candle wax and 40 years of family, feeling very specifically like a man who is exactly where he needs to be and has no idea what to do with his hands. Maria's mother was named Esperanza. She was 63 years old, small, direct, and had a way of looking at Daniel that made him feel she was performing a very thorough background check in real time and was going to give him her honest assessment shortly. He respected this immediately. He also found it somewhat terrifying, which he thought was the correct response. Esperanza Reyes had been the kind of mother who raised her children toward competence rather than comfort, which explained quite a lot about her daughter. She had worked 2 jobs through Maria's high school years. She had never said she was tired in a way that asked for acknowledgement. She had cried. Maria had told him once, exactly 3 times in Maria's memory. Once when Maria's father left, once when Maria's older brother was hospitalized with appendicitis, and once, very briefly, on the morning Maria deployed for the first time. 3 times. For a person who cried as rarely as Esperanza Reyes, 3 times was a large number. It meant those 3 things were the size of her whole world. The diagnosis had come 6 months before Maria came home. Early stage. The doctors were careful to say early, to mean that the full storm was not here yet. Only the advanced weather, the kind that tells you what is coming if you know how to read it. Esperanza's primary symptom was a specific kind of forgetting. Not names, not faces, not the deep familiar territory of long-held memory, but sequence. What happened next? What came after? The story of how one moment leads to the next moment and why. She could tell you everything about any single moment in her life with perfect clarity. She could not always tell you what order the moments went in. Her children had varying responses to this. Maria's response was to arrive, assess, and build a management structure. Within 2 weeks of being in Brownsville, she had coordinated the medical appointments, established a daily check-in schedule, identified 2 home care aides through a trusted network, and begun the administrative process of rearranging her remote work capacity so she could stay longer than anyone had initially discussed. She did all of this with the efficient, low-drama quality of someone who treats a crisis as a logistics problem because that framing is survivable and the other framings are not. What she did not do for the first month was slow down long enough to simply be with her mother. Daniel watched this. He watched it carefully, with the same attention he gave to things that mattered but hadn't announced why yet. He watched Esperanza watch Maria make spreadsheets. He saw the small, patient look on the older woman's face, not disappointment, not frustration, something more specific. The look of a person who loves someone and recognizes in them a habit they would like to name, but cannot find the right moment for. On a Tuesday afternoon in the 3rd week, Esperanza asked Daniel if he wanted to help her make tamales. He did not know how to make tamales. He said so. She said that was fine. That was the point. They spent 4 hours in the kitchen. Esperanza taught him the way her mother had taught her, which is to say with a running commentary that was equal parts instruction and autobiography, the kind of teaching that is really a form of preservation, handing something forward with both hands. He was very bad at it. She corrected him patiently, with the specific humor of someone who has been correcting other people's masa work for 40 years and finds it more entertaining than annoying. Maria came home from a phone call in the back room to find them at the kitchen table with corn husks spread across every surface and Daniel's hands covered in dough, and her mother laughing at something he had said, the full laugh, the real one, the one Maria recognized from childhood as the sound her mother made when she was genuinely happy rather than socially performing happiness. She stood in the doorway. She looked at her mother's face. Something in her, some structural thing she had been keeping load-bearing for weeks, shifted. She sat down at the table. She picked up a corn husk. She said, "Show me what you've got." Daniel looked at his masa-covered hands. "You don't want what I've got." Esperanza said, "He is right. His tamales are criminal." Maria looked at her mother. The laugh came, fast and brief and entirely real, the same laugh Daniel had noticed on her first day, the one that meant she was actually there. The afternoon opened up after that. The spreadsheets waited. The logistics waited. The 4 of them, Daniel, Maria, Esperanza, and Maria's younger sister Carmen, who arrived that evening with a bag of ancho chiles and no explanation for being 2 hours late, filled the kitchen with the kind of noise that is specifically the sound of family being itself rather than performing itself. Daniel learned that Carmen had strong opinions about masa to pork ratio. Esperanza fell asleep in her chair at the table around 9 o'clock, mid-sentence, in the instantaneous and unself-conscious way of someone who has nothing to prove about tiredness. Maria covered her with a blanket. They stood in the kitchen together after Carmen left. Esperanza asleep in the next room. The dishes done, the tamales wrapped and in the refrigerator. She was happy today, Daniel said. She was. Maria leaned against the counter. "I keep trying to fix it. I know. I can't fix it." "No." She was quiet for a moment. "I didn't come home to fix it. Technically, I came home to be here." "I know. I think I forgot that." He looked at her. The kitchen light was on, and the window above the sink was dark with night, and the house smelled like chili and corn and candle wax. And Maria Reyes was standing in the kitchen of her childhood wearing a day's worth of work and flour and something that looked, for the first time in a long time, like the particular ease of a person who is exactly where they belong. The months that followed were not simple. Esperanza's condition progressed with the slow, non-linear stubbornness of all things that cannot be rushed or reasoned with. There were good weeks, and then abrupt bad days that reminded everyone how impermanent the good weeks were. There were family arguments about care approaches, about which aid was best, about whether Esperanza should begin to consider memory care facilities, a conversation that everyone delayed as long as possible, because to have it was to accept the direction they were all traveling. Maria carried the weight of these conversations because she was the most capable one in the room, and also because she had always been the most capable one in the room, and no one, including her, had ever figured out how to redistribute that particular burden. Daniel found his work in Brownsville. He connected with a veterans outreach organization working with combat veterans in the Rio Grande Valley, first as a volunteer, then as a part-time coordinator, then as someone who was essentially doing a full-time job for a part-time salary, and didn't particularly mind because the work was the first work since Columbus that ran at the right tempo. It asked something real, it asked it consistently, and the people it served understood without explanation why some mornings are harder than others and why the door deserves watching. He was good at it, not in spite of the Crackled, but from it, which is one of the things that can happen if you're paying attention. One evening in early autumn, 14 months after they had driven south, Daniel and Maria were on the back porch of Esperanza's house. The evening was cooling toward something almost comfortable. Esperanza was asleep inside. Carmen had come for dinner and gone home. The neighborhood was doing its evening thing. A dog somewhere, a television through an open window, the far sound of the bridge traffic. Maria had the blue paracord bracelet on her wrist. She had started wearing it again 2 months in, not as a weight, but as a presence. There's a difference, and she knew the difference now. She said, "I've been thinking about the wedding." Daniel looked at her. They had not set a date. They had been engaged for 3 years, technically from the day on the kitchen floor with the Bagram ring, and before that from the day against the wall in the Crackled. There had always been a reason to wait. Columbus wasn't settled. The job situation wasn't stable. Esperanza needed time. The timing wasn't right. The timing had never been right. The timing, Daniel had come to understand, was not a condition that arrived. It was a decision you made inside imperfect conditions. "Okay," he said. "Nothing big," she said. "Here, in the house. Mommy, while she still knows what's happening." He understood what she was asking, and also what she was afraid of, that the window would close, that one day she would plan a wedding, and her mother would be present in the room, but not present in the way that counted, and she would stand at the altar with the most important person in her life missing from the moment, even while she was in the room. "When?" he said. "Spring," she said. "April. April. The month of the copper ring. The month of the morning against the wall, the radio, the crackle of contact that had interrupted a question which had eventually, in its own time, gotten answered." He looked at her for a moment. "You want to get married in April?" "Yes." "In this house?" "Yes." "With tamales, I'm assuming." "Obviously." He took her hand. The paracord bracelet was warm from her skin. "Okay," he said. It was not a speech. It was not the copper ring being slid across a medical station table. It was something quieter and more final. The particular language of two people who have been saying yes to each other across enough years, and enough difficult terrain that the word itself has become a different kind of object, worn smooth and specific by use, carrying more than it would have carried in the early days when they didn't yet know what they were agreeing to. The wedding happened on April 11th, a Saturday, in Esperanza's backyard between the bougainvillea and the old lemon tree Carmen had climbed as a child. 40 people, a justice of the peace from the veterans organization who had served in Fallujah and had a way of talking about commitment that came from somewhere lived rather than somewhere studied. Tamales, because of course. Carmen's playlist, which was perfect except for one song she clearly included for her own amusement, which Maria identified immediately, and which resulted in a look past between the sisters that contained an entire conversation. Esperanza wore a blue dress, and sat in the front row, and held a handkerchief, and cried exactly once, briefly, which by her established standard was the equivalent of a standing ovation. The copper ring was not on Maria's hand that day. It was in Daniel's pocket, front left, against his chest, the same place it had lived for 43 days in the Crackled. He had put it there that morning without thinking about it. Muscle memory, the hand finding the old place. He noticed it when he dressed. He left it there. When the justice of the peace pronounced them married, the real ring on her finger, April's sun in the lemon tree, Esperanza crying once in the front row, Daniel reached into his pocket. He held the copper ring for a moment. The fabric wrap was worn but intact. The seam was still almost invisible. Maria looked down at his closed fist. She looked up at him. He opened his hand. She looked at it for a long time. Then she took it, not to wear, just to hold. She closed her fingers around it and held it for the rest of the ceremony and the first part of the reception and set it down eventually on the table next to her plate, where it sat between a glass of water and a small vase of flowers, catching the afternoon light. A piece of wire. Not much to look at. The kind of thing that gets thrown away. What you would need to know to understand what it meant. A valley called the Valley of Death. A woman reading a book against a low concrete wall. 22 minutes of quiet. A radio. One word from a corporal who had spotted movement on a ridgeline, and the cascade of everything that followed. The contact, the blood, the decisions made in seconds, the years of finding their way back to the moment the radio interrupted. You need to know about the kitchen floor and the bracelet and the name she had finally said out loud. About Columbus and the jobs that didn't fit and the door he watched in the dark. About the tamales and the mother and the afternoon that opened up when Maria stopped trying to fix what couldn't be fixed and sat down at the table and picked up a corn husk. You need to know about all the ways a person can say yes before they say it. The copper ring sat on the table in the afternoon light. Esperanza Reyes, in the front row, now moved to a seat at a table near her daughter, reached out and picked up the ring. She turned it over in her fingers. She looked at Daniel. From before, she said. From the beginning, he said. She nodded. She set it down carefully in the exact center of the table, equidistant from the water glass and the flowers. Then keep it, she said. You earned it. He did. He keeps it still.